Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, UFOs, George Bush and obesity. A discussion with Kate Atkin. Kate is a speaker and facilitator who specialises in imposter syndrome, only it's really a phenomenon, and one which I'd love to know more about. Question of the week. Are introverts happy that the extroverts are shouting out and answering the questions, as they can then avoid the limelight? In the news lately, a letter to the Times about obesity having huge and costly medical consequences, including being by far the most important preventable risk factor for a COVID death. It goes on to ask, if COVID had struck in 1966, the year in which the brilliant electron microscopist June Almeida discovered human coronaviruses, the impact of COVID would have been at least an order of magnitude less, not only because there were fewer old people, but because the obesity epidemic had not yet begun. I thought that was a fascinating question, and it led me to think about a time when introversion wasn't considered so much of a problem. I say problem, as many people think we should be more extroverted. I wonder when that started. I'd love to know what you think on that one. UFOs were in the Washington Post, as Congress held a hearing on UFOs. The House Intelligence Subcommittee spoke not of UFOs but of UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, to try and play down the conspiracy theories. It made me think of the discussion I had with Derek Arden recently about reframing and how thinking of things differently can be useful. Or is that just a silly change of name? George Bush raised eyebrows during a speech in Dallas. He railed against the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. He then paused and corrected himself. I mean of Ukraine. I smiled when I read it, but then we all make verbal gaffes. A friend of mine recently said accountability is beating people with sticks. She didn't mean it quite like that, but it stuck. Do we need to be more accepting or better at speaking? I'll move on though before you beat me. Let's chat to Kate. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, John.
In a moment, we're going to talk a lot about imposter syndrome, why you call it a phenomenon, what difference that makes, and help people to understand the health area more. But before we do that, are you an introvert, an extrovert, and probably more importantly, what does that mean to you?
From the introvert-extrovert perspective, I definitely an extrovert. And I say was because I'm probably more of the ambivert now. I probably swayed a little bit more towards that introversion preference. I very much like to speak to think rather than think then speak. And sometimes I can drive my husband nuts because he's a high introvert and I do need to talk things out. When he thinks we've already made the decision, my brain still says I need to talk about it a little bit more before I have come to my conclusion in that decision making. Even though I still agree on the decision, I still need to speak it.
Interesting. And certainly this talk to think to talk thing is one that creates so many interesting dynamics, shall we put it like that, in business and in personal relationships. Tell me a bit more about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomena. What is it?
Yeah, we need to channel the Muppets when we talk about phenomenon. It does help if you think about the Muppet song to be able to say that properly.
No, don't. I'll start singing otherwise.
I know, it's tempting. I didn't term it phenomenon. It was termed phenomenon in 1978 by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who originally identified it as an internal sense of phoniness in academic women. Now, that's since been researched and gone a lot beyond academia and beyond the gendered perspective, because there's a vast amount of research that indicates that so many people, it's not just women that experience it, but it is this internal feeling that despite the external evidence of success, you're going to get found out. That the success you've had is somehow a fluke, that at some point they'll realize that you're not quite as good as you are. And so what happens is it comes with sometimes for some people a high level of stress and anxiety. And I say sometimes for some people because the phenomenon is really a certain point in time at certain situations. It's not an all pervasive thing that we suffer from, which syndrome has that connotation of.
Why is it that we feel it sometimes? Because you often talk to people who say they feel it all the time.
There can be a tendency to say that, oh, I feel that all of the time. But when we look at the reality of all of the time, they're probably not feeling it if they're sitting by the fireside with the cat on their lap or something like that. You know, it's situational. Sometimes certain situations will trigger higher senses of the imposter chatter, as I tend to term it, if we want to get away from syndrome versus phenomenon. It's an internal chatter inside our heads. It's not the external evidence. It's not what other people see, but this internal conversation in our head. And it can be, in particular now with meetings having gone online in the last 2 years, certain times meetings can be a trigger for people. And should I speak up? Is it okay? Do I deserve to be here in this room with these people? Certain situations or certain people may trigger a greater sense of the imposter chatter, rather than at other times it can be like having the radio on. It can be a low background noise, or it can be really blaring out and quite inhibiting your thinking.
So it's like that little internal voice, the one that's always saying, "Oh, well, you're not good enough, or you're not as good as." And I like that point about meetings, because I know many people who say to me, "Oh, I didn't want to say anything in the meeting because."
Yeah.
I read somewhere that about 3/4 of people suffer from it at some point. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a piece of research that indicates 70% of people, so that's roughly 3/4, will experience it. I tend to use the term experience rather than suffer, because when you suffer from something, it feels more pathological. It also feels more, it's disempowering, rather than if I experience something, I can do something about it. It really means that we haven't internalized the successes. We haven't looked and said, yes, I can do this. I am good at that. We've put our successes down to maybe luck or hard work, rather than allowed the success to be accepted on the inside.
I think what's interesting for me when you talk about the 70% is more that, certainly when I've experienced it in the past at times, there's always the little voice says, "Yeah, you're the only one that suffers from this," and yet clearly other people do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a few, that the 30% that's left, there's a few of those that will be experiencing the Dunning-Kruger, but there's also some people who have a very healthy sense of what they can do and what they can't do. And I think that my aim, if I've got an aim, would be to encourage those who are experiencing the imposter chatter to actually recognize, is it imposter chatter? Have you got the external evidence? How true is what you're telling yourself inside your own head? And then if you can get to this sense of, I know what I can do and I know what I can't do. I know my limitations, but actually accepting what I can do and being proud of that doesn't mean we're going to tip into that sense of arrogance and hubris and say, hey, look at me, aren't I wonderful? It's actually a good, healthy place to be.
Two things that came out for me there. One was this hubris, which I know I see with a lot of people. And I think sometimes, if I'm truly honest, I almost hold myself back because I don't want to come across like that. And I guess what you're saying there is it's important to hold both, one in each hand almost, and manage the balance between the hubris and the imposter chatter.
I think a balance is a good way of looking at it, John, that aspect of thinking about it. If there was a balance between two things, it would be courage and consideration, my thoughts are, because we need to consider how we come across to other people. We do need to think about others and the way in which we interact with them. But we also need to dig sometimes deep into our own internal courage to speak up and to say what we need to say to get our voices heard. And for some, that can need a little bit more courage. And there's also the courage to accept how good you are at things, whereas we perhaps were told with childhood messages of don't get too big for your boots. So we're not allowed in our minds to be proud of something that we have achieved. So we stay humble. And one of the things I particularly like is a quote by C.S. Lewis, I think it is, who said, true humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less.
Now, that's a really good quote. I'm going to have to steal that and use that as well. Thank you, Kate, for that one. But is it more than self-doubt? Is it worse in this Instagram age where we're always comparing ourselves to everybody else on social media?
Yeah, there's a few things I can answer to in that one. Very definitely different from self-doubt. So as you say, is it worse than self-doubt? It's different from self-doubt. Now, self-doubt, coming back to this sense of what's healthy, and I'm using that term healthy from a mental health perspective, from a well-being perspective of understanding, actually reducing the levels of anxiety that sometimes the imposter chatter can trigger for some people can be really intense. And for me personally, it used to screw up my stomach so much so I'd have really bad stomach aches. Whereas if I can accept what I'm good at, now I know more about it, the stomach aches have really lessened. So from a health perspective, the mental health and physical well-being's linked into there. But the self-doubt point is if we're doing something for the first, second or third time, that's normal to worry whether or not you can do it. It's normal to say, will it work out okay? And again, that I think is a really good place to be, coming back to this point of avoiding arrogance and hubris. It's not saying, hey, do you know what? I can do that and it'll all be fine, because you've got no external evidence to say it will be fine. But if you're doing it for the 13th or the 30th time and you've got the external evidence of success, it sounds very similar, that self-doubt. Will this go okay? Will I be found out at this point? Is it, do I have the knowledge, skills and experience to do this? But with the external evidence of success, that makes it the imposter style self-doubt, which is why it's different from normal self-doubt.
So presumably accepting evidence that we are good at what we do is an important way to deal with this feeling.
Which sounds like a very simple thing to do, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Remarkable.
But we tend to dismiss it because if it doesn't meet with our perception of ourselves, what we do, and NLP terminology, the neuro-linguistic programming terminology, tends to talk about delete, distort, and generalize. Albert Bandura, a researcher in confidence back in the 1970s, used slightly different words from that, but we talk about our self-deception. And to maintain the perception we have on ourselves, we tend to delete, distort, or generalize the external evidence, such as it's just deleted, it's just not let in, I exclude it completely. Or we'll go, but it's because I worked really hard, or it's because I happened to get lucky. Or we go, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? They're my manager and they've got to be kind to me. Or we generalize and say, well, they're giving me this feedback, they're telling me I'm great, but they'll say that to everybody. It's not specifically to me.
Accepting that experience is not as easy as it might, but it is an important thing.
It's really important. One of the things that I use in the workshops that I run and techniques that I aim to encourage people to do is to collect the positive feedback. That's the first thing. Don't delete the emails, but collect them. Review them, because you're aiming to challenge the internal perception. So we do need to keep reviewing these. And it's really helpful if those emails or the feedback, in whatever way they come, very specific about what you've done, rather than that was a great job. But when we review them, instead of going, yes, but with the delete, distort, generalize, if we could yes and it, I think, and there's not researched evidence on this, but very definitely loads of anecdotal evidence I've got. If you yes and the feedback, it helps diminish the imposter chatter. We go, yes, and I learned this from that experience.
Is there any evidence that says introverts experience this more than extroverts?
There is, and sort of there isn't. In 1995, there was some research conducted where it was correlated more highly with those with an introversion preference. Though subsequently in 2015, somebody else then found that correlation was insignificant and not proven.
Thank you. And that might be a nice point to lead on to ask for a tip for an introvert who experiences imposter syndrome and how to minimize that.
So coming back to this point of the external feedback and reviewing it, thinking about some of the messages that we were told, perhaps when we were children, and certainly from my perspective, that element of don't get too good for your boots, I would give that tip to say it is okay to own your successes, to be proud of what you've achieved. That doesn't mean that you'll tip into arrogance and hubris.
Flipping that the other way around, a tip for a non-introverted manager to help her team members to experience this less.
Yeah, this would work for an introverted or a non-introverted manager, because I think what we tend to want to do is to reassure other people. So when we're looking at managing them, we tend to say, I've got no worries about you. You're fantastic at what you do. Keep going. You're amazing. That makes it even worse. So stop telling people how amazing they are. Tell them why you think they are amazing. Don't use the accolade amazing. I would suggest people start to talk about strengths. So tell people, I see your attention to detail as one of your strengths. That was a really good job because you have a great way of dealing with other people and interacting. And I see communication as one of your strengths. So if you can give that feedback specifically without the high accolade of amazing.
Okay, I've loved having this conversation. I'm absolutely sure that some of the listeners want to get back in touch with you. What's the best place for them to do that?
Kate Atkin, no S, so Atkin, and Kate spelt with a K, so Kate. So kateatkin.com.
Thank you. I can't say I've had an amazing conversation because you'll immediately tell me off, but I have really appreciated the level of detail that you've gone into around imposter.
Phenomenon.
Thank you, Kate.
Pleasure, John. Thank you.
My takeaways from that wonderful discussion were, it's not a syndrome, it's a phenomenon, or even better, imposter chatter. Number 2, talk about experiencing it, not suffering from it. Number 3, accepting we can do something is not the same as hubris and arrogance. And finally, number 4, that wonderful quote, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Thank you to C.S. Lewis. What were your takeaways? I'd love you to add to a discussion on the Facebook page. Activate Your Introvert. What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week's question comes from a delegate at a presentation I was giving in Birmingham. Are introverts happy that the extroverts are shouting out and answering the questions as they can then avoid the limelight? Simple answer, no. No, there's no reason why being introverted means you want to hide in the shadows. It's much more common that introverts don't provide answers as quickly in a meeting because the external processing extroverts will come out and shout out answers first. When you want to get answers from your whole team, you'll need to hold back some of the louder voices and give the quieter people a moment. There's a lot more about this in running meetings that make things happen. See the sleeve notes. But being introverted does not mean you don't hold strongly held views, which should be heard. As a leader, you'll get more from your team if your whole team engage in the discussion. What question would you like answered on the show? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also follow on Facebook and discuss the answers at the show's page. Activate Your Introvert. I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.